Let's build one of these neat little moving camper windows from scratch. I'll show you every step of the way. First, I built a sample wall section made of 1.5" studs between 1/4" plywood. I apply the adhesive just as I would a real camper, using a heavy bead all the way around. A few finish nails hold the plywood in place, then I add exterior grade construction screws. The screw heads will later be covered with trim. This sample build is exactly how I do it on my campers. I mounted the wall section to a stand to help the filming process, then took the window in our house to epoxy it. It was too cold to epoxy in the garage. You can see the gleam from the cured epoxy here. Next, I record the window's depth, width, and height. These measurements will be used to make a piece of flashing. I bend an angle and transfer those measurements to the flashing. 2 quick snips at the bottom corner, then I bend it into shape. Here I'm sealing the bottom corners and adding silicone to hold the flashing. You can use whichever adhesive you prefer. Throughout the entire window build, I keep in mind that water flows downward and everything at the bottom is extra sealed. This silicone came out faster here than I wanted, so I ended up spreading it with my finger. I hammer a small nail near the top of the window on each side. It's the only place I puncture the flashing. The nail hole will be protected by the stationary top window. 2 small snips at the bottom corners, then it's time to bend the flashing outwards against the exterior opening. Notice how the flashing was installed with the first bend facing inward. That helps to keep the water from making it inside the living area should it penetrate everything else. A measurement is needed for the bottom and top sill. I cut it to size with the table saw, then to length with the miter saw. For video efficiency, I'm not going to show every saw cut, but every piece of wood had to be ran through the table saw to get the sizes I needed. Here, I'm sealing up the tiny slit in the flashing and applying some adhesive to hold the windowsill. Usually I use something different than silicone, but since this is an example build, I had extra silicone laying around and all the wood used was scrap pieces. A couple nails to hold the top piece, and a measurement is needed for the sides. So when putting these in here, you don't want the knot facing out. That's just like inviting water to enter through these little gaps. You want to just kind of get the knot facing inward. That gives the inside maybe a little bit of character. Just check your boards. Always make sure the knots will go in and that the solid, unbroken pieces go on the outside. Some adhesive is applied and the side pieces are put in. Silicone was? I placed the nail gun where I applied the adhesive so that the nail is surrounded by adhesive as it travels through. I don't really want nails down here because I want all this to be kind of unbroken. This is going to be your movable area. Measure for center and mark it, then measure for the thickness of your window frame and mark that. 6 5/8, it's going to be the center of our windows. I want to use 3/4 inch window frames. So I'm just going to measure out 3/4 inches. Sometimes I won't use the edge there. I'll just kind of go like this. 1/2 3/4, 3/8. And 3/8. You want the top and bottom of the window frame to straddle the center mark equally. Measure your width now that your sill and sides are installed. I cut 3/4 by 3/4 pieces for the window frame, then set the table saw to 3/8 inch high and made this channel on the center line. This channel holds the window glass. Now I measure for my vertical frame pieces by placing the top and bottom pieces in there temporarily. So you have your slit here and your slit here. I measure the glass. 6 1/4 is too big. It won't squeeze all the way down. Then measure the width of the glass. Keep in mind you want the glass to be larger than the opening all the way around, but slightly smaller than the depth of your channels for expansion and contraction. I'm using acrylic sheet in this example and just showing that it can be cut with a table saw. It can be cut a bunch of different ways. This is pre-epoxied. I'm using old stock that I already cut on my last build and I already had epoxied. Here's a good shot of how the glass sits in there when placed correctly. Now fill your first channel with sealer and place your glass in. Squish the glass down into the sealant. It's the same process all the way around while making sure to add a little extra in the corners where the frame pieces meet. You'll want to use enough that it creates a good seal here. I make sure to check for square, then clean up the excess sealant. You see how that pushed out there? It's good to see it pushed out there. Then you take these corners here and you just fill them up. You don't want water getting in. This is nothing about this is complex. You're just making a box and putting something to look through in a piece of glass. I use tape to hold one frame together and a clamp on the other to show there's multiple ways of doing it. I make sure to sand for a nice clean edge. So now what I want to do is sand this a little bit. And you want to favor this down a little bit so that the water will run off the sill when it's all said and done. Okay, and then I'm going to sand the tiniest little channel right here for the water. That channel won't be visible unless looking for it, and it will help the water escape faster. You could tilt the lower sill, but I prefer this as it makes framing the window opening a heck of a lot less complicated. The windows are drying. I want to get my measurement for the bottom and top piece of trim there. I want to keep this face out about 1/4 inch. Leaving that little bit of space ends up looking really good. 1 3/4 inches. So my trim is going to be 1.5 inches wide. 1 3/4 inches. Well, 11.5 inches. So I cut those on the table saw, and here I'm using a paint can to mark rounded corners. I cut a bit off each corner with the miter saw and hand sand the rest of the curve. During this process, I decided to paint the exterior side as well. At first, I was just going to leave it epoxied since this is just an example, but then I thought I'd keep it as accurate as to how I do it as possible. Normally, I'd epoxy, then paint, then start on the windows. Around the windows, I keep an unpainted area. It's just preference. I'd rather apply adhesive to the prepped epoxy than adhesive to paint. Either way would work fine since this is just trim that's being installed. Now a few more things need epoxied. I started with the exterior window trim, then the window opening, and any section of our 2 windows that hadn't yet been epoxied. If you epoxy those window frame pieces before installing the glass in them, the channels will be too tight. Epoxy is kinda thick. Since this video is designed to instruct a first-time window build, I am epoxying, measuring, and cutting as I go, just as you would if you were trying for your first time. Now that I've built a few of these windows, I take all the measurements first, make the cuts and epoxy beforehand, but that's not how I learned to do it. Experience allows all that initial prep. Here I'm making sure that every little edge is covered in epoxy. If you suspect that any piece of wood will be exposed to water, epoxy it. I make sure the sides, the front, the bottoms, the back, everything that I think will have water touching it will be epoxied. Here the epoxy is dried and I'm test fitting the windows to more clearly show that the lower window needs to be built about 1/16 of an inch narrower so that it can easily slide in the opening, whereas the top window should fit tight. The thickness of the epoxy will change measurements, so keep that in mind. So the next move we got to make is to take this measurement, how deep is this, and then make a piece that's 1.5 inches wide, or 1.25 inches is what I like to do on the inside. We're gonna make a piece of 1.5 inch wide, but it's an L-shaped piece of trim, and we're gonna cut that out with the table saw. But we have to know how deep this is here. I'm marking here to account for the overlap that I want to allow on the top veneer. You can see the window is going to slide against these. I will now epoxy that edge and the inner corner of that trim. I try to imagine where the water will touch and always treat that area. The inside of this trim will remain untreated to match the rest of the inside of my campers. I retake this measurement since things are epoxied now. Then I cut this piece of 3/4 by 3/4. Then I mark the depth of the interior window trim. Now mark and cut the interior trim to fit around the 3/4 inch piece. Here I'm prepping the epoxied surface to accept the 3/4 inch piece. Lightly sanding and cleaning with denatured alcohol helps adhesives stick to the extremely hard epoxy surface. I also prep for the interior trim. Sealant is applied to each bottom corner and a full bead is applied along the interior side. The 3/4 inch piece that goes here is probably the most important piece of this whole setup as it blocks water from entering from the sill. Using enough sealant here is critical. I like to use my finger to make it nice, to really work that in there. And go back across it a couple times, really get it in that seam. Then a little towel just to kind of clean up the excess. You really want to work that in there pretty good. I'll even do it again sometimes if I ain't feeling it. We'll come across the front here. Some of it's squished out, I can see. Go ahead and, if you got a little extra on your finger, run it again. That's what I like to do with it. If there's any extra, I run it in those seams good. For interior trim, I use a couple dabs of adhesive along with finish nails. The nails just aren't enough. Now we can add our top and bottom trim. I measured for them a bit earlier. With the interior trim installed, I begin sealing the exterior side of that trim. First a light sand, then cleaned with denatured alcohol. Work the sealant in and flat as possible. The window will slide here and we don't want it necessarily rubbing against the sealant. As that dries, I install the exterior trim. I etch the epoxy surface, clean it with denatured alcohol, apply adhesive, and nail the trim on. And I make sure to seal the tiny gap between the flashing and the sill all the way around. Before installing the top trim, I apply a thick bead of adhesive. This bead is a barrier to water entry from the top if the outer bead of sealant should fail. I curve the bead a little down each side of the window. Next, a couple dabs of adhesive along the sides and bottom, making sure to apply it over the screw heads. With the new trim on, there are new gaps to be sealed, but first I prep the area with a very light sand, then clean with denatured alcohol. I go thick on this bead and use my finger to smooth and shape it. I have tried a lot of caulking tools and none have worked as well as my finger. I tape where the trim meets. That tiny gap needs sealed too. I use my finger to really force the sealant down in there. The tape keeps everything neater looking. Then of course the outside edge needs sealed and smoothed flat. And I always follow up with a flashlight to make sure there are no bubbles and that the sealant looks applied well. It's easy to miss an area with clear sealant. course, you got to get the windows too. If it's the kitchen window, I only seal the exterior side. If it's the bathroom window, I seal both sides of the glass. I give it a day to cure, then prep it for varnish. First, I lightly sand the surface. The varnish container recommends 320 grit. Then clean that up with alcohol. I'm stressing the use of denatured alcohol as it doesn't leave a residue behind and creates a great surface for sealants to adhere to. Soaps and standard cleaners could hinder that. Got to clean those window frames as well. The varnish I'm using is, and I used on my campers, is Halcyon varnish by Total Boat. It's clear gloss, it's water-based, and you can recoat after 1 hour. For this example, I'm just going to apply 1 coat of varnish. For my camper builds, I apply 5 coats of varnish over the 2 coats of epoxy. Varnish is a UV protectant and sealer that keeps the epoxy from breaking down and yellowing. The epoxy is a super durable sealant that a lot of folks put on garage floors and drive cars over. Together, they are like a super protector of wood. Now let's build a window screen. I temporarily install the top window to get my measurement, then cut some pieces to 1/2 inch by 3/8 inch. I cut the horizontal pieces and install them to get my vertical measurement. The technique here involves simply sandwiching the screen between 2 frames, so I cut 8 pieces for each screen, and those need epoxied and varnished too. Here I'm using a bucket to let the pieces cure. It's tough to find something that epoxy won't stick to. With those dry, I lay 4 pieces down and begin assembling the screen. Notice the top and bottom pieces extend to the corners. I add the screen by using a couple pieces of scrap wood to keep it tight while it dries. Nailing the wood to the workbench is a quick and easy way to achieve this. I prefer to use rigid adhesive for this. I want stiffness over flexibility. Gorilla's clear, max strength construction adhesive works well for this. As I lay the vertical pieces, notice they extend to the corner. This allows the joints to overlap, and the pieces will need to be cut to length to account for this. I've tried to do it the other way, where the pieces are equal lengths on both sides of the screen, but the end result was a weak feeling screen overall. I add some weight and give it a day to dry. I drill a tiny hole in the middle of each vertical frame piece. These are for removable screws. For this example, I rounded the edge on the sliding window. It's possible that a sharp squared edge could slowly scrape away the sealant along the sliding surface, although these windows will barely ever move and be in one position for long periods of time. I apply a thick bead of sealant favoring the exterior side of the window, being careful not to let any sag into the sliding window's track. The screen gets pressed in, and I check the sliding window for freeness. These 2 tiny brass screws will blend in well while allowing the screen to be removed for window cleaning. As this is not a factory fit, on purpose, there's a tiny gap at the bottom of the screen so that water that enters the sill can drain underneath it. I put an exterior bead of sealant around the top window, and the final step is a coat of varnish on the sealant. It's unnecessary, but I like to do it because sealant cures and dries but remains kinda tacky. It will hold dust on it. It's rubbery too. The varnish makes the window so much easier to clean. You could stop here at the sealant or add something to take the tackiness away. I'm just using varnish in this case. There's probably a better product out there. Well, there you have it, a moving wooden window. I use these in my campers, but I imagine the technique doesn't have to be limited to campers. They could be made to any size, and if they're stationary windows, they are way easier to construct. These two are examples of size potential. They were made during my last build, but I scratched them and removed them. Now for a bonus. Many of you have asked if you could make them in dual pane. Here's one I made as an example, minus all the epoxy and varnishing. The technique is all the same. You just cut 2 swipes with the table saw on each piece of window frame. I'm going to whiz through its construction as you guys have basically seen it happen already. Here's how it looked for me. Okay, and then there's a dual pane window. Real simple, real basic. And here's how much I'm worried about these windows leaking. This is my first shot at an in-depth how-to video. If you want more like it, please let me know in the comments and consider subscribing. I'm planning a new, very creative camper build as we speak. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.